so good. We move back to Sweden here, and Anders Lyngfelt, who's obviously the inspiration behind this meeting here, is going to talk to us about how to finance the future of negative emissions. Anders.
Yeah. So there is a problem with negative emission when it comes to incentives. Normal emissions from fossil CO2, can be incentivized by a tax or a fee or something like that, which brings in money. But negative emissions are incentivized by paying for them. So someone has to pay for it. So that's the reversed situation. No finance minister. They can get a lot of money by a CO2 tax, but when it comes to negative emissions, they have to spend money. And that means someone has to be made to pay for the negative emissions. And as I pointed out yesterday, it's a lot of money if we look at the median scenario. 100 tons per now living human being, or 10,000 euros per now living being approximately, assuming 100 euro per ton of cost. So one possibility is, of course, to have the taxpayers pay for this, for instance, via carbon tax and building these big funds and building them well in advance, because ideally we will not have any fossil CO2 emissions to tax in the later part of the century, but we will still need to do a lot of negative emissions. But there's always a risk that finance ministers would have difficulties in giving the full priority for using this money for negative emissions, especially if negative emissions are supposed to happen somewhere else in another region or in another country. And there is a very big difficulty to share these costs in a decent way. I assume a lot of countries would have a number of reasons why they should do less. So if we've had so big difficulties in agreeing for 25 years on a carbon tax or a similar incentive which could bring in money to the finance minister, how could we expect the world to be able to share the cost of negative emissions? That's a big question. So another option is to include it in a cap and trade system, such as the ETS in Europe. I think it's a really bad idea. It would mean that the fossil emissions would increase correspondingly, so no net effect on the atmosphere, and a catastrophe for the public acceptance. Who would appreciate storage if it doesn't make a difference, if it just leads to more fossil emissions? And another thing is, if we really would succeed in totally stopping fossil fuels and fossil fuel emissions, we would have no oil and gas industry left. So the deep competence needed for negative emissions, at least for BECCS, would be totally lost. I mean, they have learned this from making enormous amount of money on selling expensive petrol. I mean, it's not trivial to drill a hole 1 to 5 kilometers down in the ground, or even below the sea floor, and I mean, line this long line, and I mean, it doesn't work so good just to have a straight line down. I think you need to do it like this, and I think it takes a lot of competence and technology to do this. So I think somehow we would need the oil and gas industry. I mean, this competence is a spin-off of their very of their operations that they earn very much money from. And I guess we also will have in the future a need for liquid purposes like aviation, where other options are difficult. So aviation is, I think it's around 1 gigaton per year now, and it's the fastest growing sector in the terms of CO2 emissions. It may increase by a factor of 4 until 2050. And if for comparison, I would say that if all the people in the world in the future will fly as much as we do in Sweden now, the emissions from aviation would be 10 gigaton per CO2 per year. So, well, some Swedes have a bit of climate angst for flying. And we should certainly discourage people from flying a lot by imposing some sort of CO2 taxes. I mean, aviation fuel is very cheap compared to petrol. So, yeah. In Sweden, there's been an intensive moral discussion on aviation, and a number of famous Swedes, together with Kevin Anderson, have declared they will stop flying entirely. So I couldn't help writing a debate article about this. I had been trying for 1.5 years to get an article in this big Swedish newspaper, Dagens Nyheter. But I finally succeeded with this one. And I think it was because I gave them the opportunity to have a bit of a provocative title. This means how future aviation can save the climate. So the idea was to propose that future aviation should pay for negative emission by an overcompensation of their emissions. Or more precisely, that the oil and gas companies are forced to large overcompensations of the emissions of the fuels they sell. For instance, by a ratio of 2 or 3. So this means for every single ton of CO2 that their products emit, they would need to do 2 or 3 tons of negative emissions. So, and I call this ratio the green to fossil factor, or the green factor. So, and it's defined as the CO2 removed from atmosphere by negative emissions divided by the CO2 released from the fossil fuels. So, and this shows it graphically. So the emission, if the emission is 1 ton and the compensation, the green factor is 1, then they equal. So there is no overcompensation, only compensation, and an overcompensation you get if you have a higher green factor. So, and this green factor could of course be gradually introduced, starting at low numbers. And having the oil industry as responsible, I mean, this, you force them to sell petrol that is compensated to a higher or lower degree. We don't mix in the finance departments and the finance ministers who wants to have this money in their own pockets, perhaps. So, and now if we look at the cost and compare it to the incentives, we can see that a number of countries have very high costs for petrol, between 0.55 and almost up to 0.7 euro per kilogram of CO2 emitted. So UK, France, Germany and Sweden are around 0.55. And CCS now, I believe, is around 0.1 euro per kilogram. So it wouldn't make a big difference to have an overcompensation of a factor of 2. And I mean, if we need to incentivize the car owners to stop using petrol and using, for instance, electric cars, I think we really need to raise the cost of petrol further, and this could be a possibility. And well, 2/3 of this price is anyway taxes. And in Sweden, a lot of it is called carbon tax. So it's the carbon tax in Sweden is 0.12 actually. And I believe personally that the CCS can be a lot cheaper. The capture, I think, should be possible to get down to 0.2. That's my belief. So, and if we look at the effects then, if we have a green factor of 2 or 3, and assume a cost of negative emissions between 0.05 and 0.1, the added cost per liter of petrol is between 0.2 and 0.7 euros per liter, which corresponds to cost increase of the fuel price between 15 and 46%. I think the message from one report in Sweden some years ago was that we need to increase the petrol price by a factor of 3 to reach a carbon neutral vehicle fleet. And then if we look at air flight, assuming a flight from Los Angeles to Stockholm, which is rather far, I believe it emits about 0.9 tons of CO2 with a green factor and emission cost of 50 to 100 euro per ton. This would correspond to an added cost of the flight of 90 to 180 euro. And for a higher green factor, we're up to 135 to 270 euro. But that's for a fairly long flight. I think that should be reasonable. So what about coal? I haven't talked about coal, but the present price of coal is around $60 per ton, which corresponds to around 17 euro per ton of CO2 emitted, which is very, very low. So it's a very, very cheap fuel, that's why it's popular. But a carbon tax or a carbon fee of 50 euro per ton, which is basically the minimum of what's needed now, would increase the coal price by a factor of 6. So I think if we're going to solve the climate problem, coal cannot be part of the solution, and it will very, very quickly disappear if we have any relevant pricing mechanism. So what if biogenic fuels are cheaper than the overcompensated fossil fuel oil? Then we're in trouble. Then we get no money for the negative emissions. That is, unless we make the users, producers of biogenic liquid fuels also pay a fair compensation. Yeah. So, hey, what? Compensate for what? Aren't they already fossil-free? Well, I think using biomass to produce liquid fuels is wasting a valuable resource that should be used to clean up the atmosphere instead of merely substituting fossil fuels that we shouldn't use anyway. So the climate efficiency of producing fuels from biomass is pretty low compared to using it for negative emissions. So I propose to have a corresponding factor for biogenic fuels, which would solve the problem. So, and what could be done now? We could, of course, start already now to to use the carbon tax or aviation tax to build funds for negative emissions and buy negative emissions at best price, thus starting the technology development and the needed infrastructure, and allow individuals, companies and organizations to buy real negative emissions from this fund to be able to compensate their actions. I think there should be a big interest in this. And I think really it would be reasonable to demand that the citizens, organizations and companies would have the possibility to buy real negative emissions. I mean, everyone who is concerned, who doesn't want to fly, yes, I think they should have this possibility. So this is my summary, it's short. Thank you.